Yeah, when he was, is it there?
I think so.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I'll go backwards on that one if that's interesting.
Yeah.
It was on the Burrard Chief, and they ran aground off Main Island, and they started taking on water. So everybody left the ship. By this time, even the captain. Dad was down in the stoke shutting off the oil fire, because if the boilers will explode if they get, the change in temperature. They shut the fires off. By the time he got everything done and ready to, he left the stokel or the engine room. He was climbing upside down up the ladder, and he just got on deck in time for the Cora Larson or the deckhand to grab hold of his hand, and they heaved him up onto the barge in time, just as the ship turned over and smashed the funnel off on the scows that they were towing and sunk.
When was that?
Pardon?
When was that?
Off the top of my head, I would say sometime around between 35 and 37. Because I was working, because I remember we came home, and phone rang. Dad was on the phone. He said, "I just wanted to tell you that the Burrard Chief is sunk, but we're all okay." Because if they got to know about it, then your mother would, or your granny or your nan would have flipped out. So Uncle Ernie and I spent probably the rest of the evening. We knew where she was, but we didn't know their name. We knew the address for some reason or other. And we went through the phone book looking for that address to attach a name to it so we could phone her and tell her before it happened. Well, she finally came home. And being as subtle as a bloody 10-ton truck, she walked in the door. I said, "The Burrard Chief is sunk." She passed out cold. By the time we got her around and told her that Dad was okay, it was alright, she was mad as hell. You know, she was mad. You know, I mean, could have done it a little more gently, but.
Guess you would want to put it in the reverse.
Yeah, Dad's okay, but this is, yeah, but not me. Just blurted it out. Christ. Yeah, and there's all kinds of neat things like that. Time that they were out, he was on the Burrard Chief, and they were out helping the Storm King out off the race, trying to get a boom of logs around the race before it went up on race rocks, and they're towing it together, side by side, and there's quite a sea running, and the Storm King was bobbing up and down, and so was the Burrard Chief. And on those old tugs, they had one hell of a heavy, thick rubbing strake. And the Burrard rubbing strake got over top of the Storm King's rubbing strake, and the Storm King came up, and the Burrard Chief went down and literally lifted the deck clear of the hull, on one side. And right until the day they scrapped the Burrard Chief, that hole was there, and all it was stuffed with, filled with was oakum. They'd stuffed oakum in it. Of course, it opened it up, and then it came back together again, and then they caulked it with oakum, and that's the way it was running when they scrapped her. God, I tell you, some of that stuff, They used to go up when he was on the Salvage Queen. They used to go up to Nootka Sound from Victoria and tow those. You know what a Davis raft is. You know what a log boom is. Well, you've seen those booms where they're stacked. They're all bundled and stacked. Yeah. Well, so what they did, they were called Davis rafts. And what they did, they started out and they loaded. They lashed all the logs together and then started stacking them and lashing them and starting it. And it was like a ruddy iceberg. There was probably 20 feet or more of logs above the water, but there was probably as much as that below the water with the weight on them. And the old Burrard Chief, not the Burrard Chief, but the Salvage Queen was an old ship. It was so old that when they used to chip the hulls to clean the old paint off before they painted them again, you could drive a chipping hammer through the plates. And what they did, they used to put a cofferdam across the frames on the inside of the hull and then fill it full of concrete. Well, everything was rotten. It was an old ship. And when they were towing, it used to take them 10 days to tow these Davis rafts down from Nootka Sound, depending on the weather, into Victoria Harbour. And I remember Dad saying that you'd get those under tow with a bit of a sea running, and you could literally see the winch, towing winch, lifting the deck. And they just went round and round and round the clock. They were just exactly the same as what they're doing today. In fact, I don't know what's happening here, but with these trucks and no testing, they're just driving accidents waiting to happen around the province. Well, these companies were working. These towing companies, tugboat companies, and the rest of them were all working on the same deal. If they had to shut it down, they were losing money, so they just kept it going as long as it would go. In fact, they were required by law to have a boiler inspection at least once a year. And they, on one occasion, he came home, and he said, "Well, oh," Nan said, "You're home? You're not? Were you tied up?" He said, "No." He said, "I just tied the boat up." He said, "Well, how come?" He said, "I refused to take it out until we get a boiler inspection." So he said, "I don't know whether I've got a job." But anyhow, he got a phone call to say that they were going to take it down, to, shut her down and do a boiler inspection. Yeah. He made one trip to on a halibut boat, the Bering Sea. He said, "I've been to sea all my life," but he said, "I was never so seasick for so long." In fact, he made one trip and quit. Yeah. Well, now that segment is over. Excuse me. Is there anything you can glean out of that you might want to clarified, or excuse me?
I'll show your tape down for that.
Is that off?
No, it's on again.
Oh, and we'd go for, depending on how long the trip was. Like it's going to go to Victoria, and then like I was on one trip. We left Vancouver, and went to Victoria, to Brackman and Kerrs, and unloaded what they had, and then went up to Bemerton and loaded cement, and went back to Vancouver, and then up to New Westminster and home. That was about a it was probably a 10-day, 2-week trip. And Uncle Ernie was over one time. I said, "Have you been to Ladner?" "Oh yeah," he said, "I was at Ladner." He said, "I was on at Ladner on the old grainer with Dad." They got into Ladner to unload. See, Ladner was a farming community, so they went into Ladner to unload feed and hay, or grain and hay, or load it, one way or the other. I'm not sure. And Uncle Ernie was aboard with Dad, of course, and so they sent him up to a place somewhere in Ladner, close to where they were docked, to pick a bunch of cherries.
Mm-hmm.
So we wound up going up and getting a bag full of cherries for him. But that method of washing up I was telling you about, they were still using that on the grainer.
Really?
Yeah. And the CPR. They didn't have any showers. Not until a lot of, later years. But, and, the conditions were terrible. Another little gem. Remember, when your father came, he was came to work in this country. And, they went, I don't know what boat it was on. It was probably the May or the Royal. And of course, on the English ships, they had what they called a black pan. And the food was prepared in the galley, whatever it was, and it was put in a great big pan, a big black, it was black, because I've seen them. And to transport the food from the galley to the aft end where the crew was, or the forecastle where the crew was, depending on what kind of a ship, because a lot of those ships were built with a forecastle and a well deck, a bridge, like the superstructure, and then the aft end was more living quarters for for whatever crew. They either segregated the firemen and the deckhands, because there were two different classes. If you were stokehold crew or black gang, you didn't associate with the deckhands, and the vice versa, so on. And to transport the food from the galley, because the galley was usually amidships, right under the bridge, or somewhere amidships. They transported the food. They had these black pans. It was a great big black pan with a lid on it and a handle, and you had to get it from A to B, no matter what the weather was. So they wound up with a black pan, and then they took it. They dished it up themselves out of the black pan, and your father used to have a saying. The food in our house was always put on the table, no matter what it was. Pies or cakes or what have you. Nan dispensed it, granted, but if there was cake on the table or cake on the plate or something else, Father would say, there's as much as you want, but think of your shipmates. No, I mean, everybody's into this, and you had a portion, so that's what you got. I mean, that's what was allotted to you. Whether you didn't know how much, you don't know how much, but you divided whatever there was between everybody. So hence used to say, think of your shipmates. Well, this incident, these two stokers or firemen or whatever they were, came to work for the CPR, and they were old country. They'd come off probably the same way as your grandfather on some ship, deep sea ship. But they were English, or whatever their nationality. They were Scottish, or they were British. Let's put it that way. So in the CPR, things were a little different. Now you're getting Canadianized, and you went to the galley, and because everything is inside. You're still living. Your sleeping quarters were still segregated, but the galley, or the mess room, as they call it, was there. And of course there was. I'm not exactly sure whether the mess room was segregated or not, but anyhow, there was the mess room. Well, they had flunkies, Chinese flunkies, most of those CPR bullets, and the meals were prepared. You had this for this day, and this for that day, and that for another day, and that's the way it was dispensed. But on this occasion, there had been 2 apple pies put in the mess for the crew, and I mean, dispensing. It was always segregated. It was always, cut. But I mean, there it was. They got 2 pies on the table, and these 2 guys were coming off watch. See these 2 pies. Nobody around. They just come off a hungry ship, grabbed the 2 pies and headed for the forecastle. So Dad's in the forecastle. Said, hey, come and see what we got. Pull back the bed sheets or bed covers, and here's these 2 apple pies. Dad said, where the hell did you get those? Oh, he said, we got them out of the mess hall, or the mess room. He said, you bloody fools. He said, you've stolen your own supper. Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's funny. There's a lot of these. I've got some of that book that you've got, that Wales No More. It's autographed by the guy that wrote it.
Oh.
Your mother saw the book and thought I would like it. And the author was there, this Hagelin was there. And your mom was telling him that I had known Maxie Lobrunner and Finn John and all the, I think, a bunch of the guys that were on that whaling fleet. So he just wrote in it, something to the effect to Arthur Beadle, a friend of Maxie Lobrunner, who inspired me to write this book.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some more around there. There's some more books around the house with that. I'm almost sure there's some over. We've got some that with the Staticona in it, not as the Staticona, but it's in Vancouver Harbor. It was a boat called, after her rum running career ended, they made it into a cruise ship, like harbor cruises. It was called the Moonlight Maid. It used to take, evening or night cruises around Vancouver Harbor or out around Georgia Straits or what have you. But yeah. But all those, all your ancestors, every damn one of them, they were all sailors, seamen of some description. There was nothing else in the British Isles in those days. If you weren't a farmer, you were a seaman at sea, because the British merchant fleet was probably one of the biggest in the world, the hungriest and the dirtiest. You'd wonder how people could live like it, but I guess they didn't know any different.
I think it was better than what you had on the shore.
Pardon?
I think it was better than what they had
Well,
on the
they
shore.
probably were eating.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't good, they were probably eating and living a hell of a lot better. Christ. I remember, my dad used to say, he used to always call it the lousy country. To say that he had such a limited education, he was very well read. And he used to call it the lousy country, and he used to say, quote, the happiest memories of my life, he said, were spent in that lousy country. And he said the pages of English history are the blackest in the world. And he said, I've watched young women selling their souls to eat. And he was a socialist. And I mean, he was a socialist. He was a real commie. Yeah. But he was as honest as the day is long, and fine morals. He was very moral. The only time I ever heard him swear was when I was about, I wasn't going to school yet, I don't think. No, I wasn't going to school. came home from the boat. This would be in probably 1920, 21. But before we went to Cowichan Lake, or Cowichan, the charter siding, and we were living in a house on Bean Street in Victoria West. And we came home and the linoleum, or the Congolium, it was Congolium, that was starting to turn up in the joint. He decided to sort of tack it down. So we got a hammer and tacks. He's busy tacking it down, all of a sudden he splat. I remember, all of a sudden I heard him say, "Jesus bloody Christ." And he'd whacked his thumb with a hammer and split it wide open. But that's the only time I ever saw him, or ever heard him swear. Yeah. Now, do you want me to tell you about the horse thieves and the sheep stealers? Because your great grandfather, that Russ said, he was from the Isle of Man, and your grandfather McDonald, the McDonalds, the Scotsman, used to go down to the Isle of Man and steal sheep.